Les Misérables ended with Jean Valjean's death, but what if love itself carried the same curse, and Cosette was destined to repeat the tragedy? Les Misérables, the second chapter. Written by Victor Hugo.
The morning air in Paris was unusually still, as though the city itself had paused to mourn. In the modest apartment that once belonged to Jean Valjean, silence hung heavy, thick with absence. The once vibrant warmth of his presence, the resolute strength, the quiet, unwavering moral compass, was now replaced by an emptiness that seemed almost tangible. Cosette sat by the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring out at the streets below where life carried on, indifferent to her grief. It had been 3 days since Jean Valjean's passing. The small funeral had been simple, almost painfully so. Only a handful of those who had known him intimately attended. Marius, silent and solemn, old friends of Valjean, their eyes red-rimmed, and a few villagers who had once benefited from his generosity. The priest had spoken softly, reminding them that the soul of a good man leaves the world quietly, leaving behind deeds and memories as testament to his life. Yet for Cosette, words were hollow. The man who had raised her, who had loved her as fiercely as a father could, was gone. And with him had vanished the last tether she had to the life she had once known, before the comforts of wealth and relative safety had been placed around her. Marius, though outwardly calm, carried his own burden. The political struggles that had occupied his mind for years seemed now sharper, more urgent. Paris was a city teetering on the edge of change, and while he had always dreamed of participating in the shaping of that future, he now felt the oppressive weight of responsibility. To honor the man who had saved him in his youth, to protect Cosette from harm, and to navigate the labyrinth of societal injustice that surrounded them. He had promised Jean Valjean that Cosette would be safe, yet now he wondered if any human promise could withstand the cruel tides of fortune. Cosette, for her part, moved through the days with a kind of mechanical grace. She prepared meals with meticulous care, kept the apartment orderly, and maintained the routines that Jean Valjean had instilled in her. But each task felt hollow, each moment punctuated by the echo of absence. At night, she would sit by the fireplace, staring into the dull glow of embers, remembering his voice, soft, patient, commanding, and the way he had carried himself with a dignity that seemed impossible to emulate. Yet, as days turned to weeks, life insisted upon intrusion. A letter arrived from a distant relative, politely requesting that Cosette consider investing her inherited wealth into a charitable enterprise in the city's poorer districts. While the proposition seemed logical, even noble, Cosette's heart recoiled. She had seen the suffering Valjean had endured, the lives of those crushed under the wheels of poverty and injustice, and she knew that mere charity could not erase the bitterness of inequity. She thought of the men and women she had glimpsed during her childhood, the faces etched with despair, the children with hollow eyes who reminded her of Michael, the boy from the market, bright-eyed but hungry and wary. Marius, observing her distant expressions, attempted conversation one afternoon, his voice careful and measured. "Cosette," he said gently, "I know you grieve still, but life must go on. We cannot linger forever in the shadow of those we have lost." Cosette's lips trembled, but she nodded. "I know, Marius, yet the shadow is long. I feel it in every corner of this city, in every street we walk. It follows me." He reached for her hand, a gesture of comfort and grounding. "Then we walk together, and perhaps in our footsteps we will find a path forward." Despite his words, the uncertainty that had begun to creep into their lives was not easily dispelled. The world outside their apartment remained indifferent, bustling with the daily struggles of Parisian life. Vendors hawked their wares with shouting voices, children ran barefoot over cobbled streets, and carriages rumbled with the rhythmic inevitability of wheels upon stone. Within these ordinary sounds, Cosette felt the omnipresence of fate, an invisible hand guiding lives in directions both cruel and unforeseeable. One evening, as twilight spread across the rooftops and the city seemed to hold its breath, Cosette wandered into the garden of their small courtyard. The air was fragrant with the scent of late-blooming flowers, yet her heart was heavy. She knelt beside a patch of violets and touched their delicate petals. "Jean Valjean," she whispered, "I hope you can see that I am trying, that I am worthy of all you gave me." Marius, watching from the doorway, understood the truth in her words. No measure of affection or education could fully reconcile her to the absence of a man who had been more than a father. There was only the slow, inexorable march of time, punctuated by moments of memory and the unavoidable progression of life. As the days unfolded, Cosette began to correspond with a few of Valjean's old acquaintances. Men and women who had witnessed his acts of kindness, who had been touched by his unwavering integrity. Through these letters, she discovered stories she had never known. How Valjean had secretly assisted families in hiding during times of hardship. How he had paid off debts for strangers. How his quiet interventions had altered destinies without fanfare. Each revelation deepened her understanding of the man she had lost and underscored the magnitude of the void he had left behind. Marius, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn into the political sphere. The injustices that Valjean had confronted in silence were now visible in broad daylight. Corruption among city officials, neglect of the poor, and the widening gulf between the privileged and the destitute. He began attending meetings, writing articles, speaking quietly but passionately to anyone who would listen. It was a delicate balance, honoring Valjean's memory while asserting his own voice in a world that often preferred silence. Yet even as they struggled to navigate their grief and their responsibilities, a quiet truth emerged. Life was unrelenting. The streets of Paris, the faces of the people, the daily chores and obligations, they all demanded attention. Cosette realized that though she had lost a father, she had inherited a mission: to live fully, with compassion and courage, and to ensure that Valjean's legacy would endure not in monuments or plaques, but in the actions of those he had loved. And so, as night fell over the city, casting long shadows over cobblestones and rooftops, Cosette and Marius sat together by the window. In the fading light, they held each other close, sharing the quiet understanding that grief was but one part of existence. Outside, the city pulsed with life, indifferent yet beautiful in its unyielding continuity. And in that moment, they both knew. The story of Jean Valjean had ended, but their own had only just begun. The months following Jean Valjean's passing brought a new rhythm to Cosette and Marius's lives, yet the cadence was uneven, marked by quiet unease beneath the surface of routine. Their apartment, once a sanctuary of protection and inherited peace, now bore the subtle weight of expectation. Cosette moved through her days with precision, tending to household affairs, maintaining the silverware polished and the hearth perpetually warm. Marius, meanwhile, devoted himself to matters far beyond their walls, to a Paris alive with whispers of reform and rumblings of unrest. It was in these seemingly mundane moments that the first shadows began to creep. Cosette noticed the strain in Marius's eyes after long hours of political meetings, the fatigue that pulled at his shoulders even as he feigned composure. She saw the letters he received from citizens pleading for assistance, from the poor and overlooked, their words blunt and urgent. And though Marius believed himself capable of remedying every injustice, Cosette understood that no single man could bear such a burden alone. One afternoon, as rain tapped a steady rhythm against the tall windows, Cosette prepared tea. She moved with care, her mind drifting to the faces of those she had glimpsed during her childhood, those who lived on the margins, who struggled quietly, often unseen. She remembered Michael, the boy with the frayed school bag, whose laughter had been as fleeting as the wind across the rooftops. She felt a pang of guilt for the comfort that now enveloped her, a softness that shielded her from the harshness she had once known. Marius entered, carrying a bundle of papers. "Cosette," he said, a hint of frustration threading his voice, "I have spoken with the council again. They are unwilling to allocate sufficient resources for the southern districts. The children, the families, they are suffering still." Cosette placed a hand on his arm. "You cannot carry it all alone," she whispered. "Even Jean Valjean could not have done so. He did what he could, but the world is vast and cruel." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, yet to do nothing feels like betrayal. To remain silent is to allow injustice to fester. And yet, every action I take seems inadequate." The conversation faded into silence, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of rain. In that quiet, Cosette recognized a pattern. The world, with all its intricacies, demanded constant vigilance, and the ideals they had inherited from Valjean, compassion, mercy, courage, required more than sentiment. They demanded endurance, a willingness to bear burdens far beyond one's own strength.
As the weeks passed, these pressures began to manifest in subtler ways. Tension flickered in conversations that once had been filled with laughter. Small disagreements over finances, charitable obligations, or household decisions became points of friction. Cosette, ever aware of Marius's responsibilities, sometimes restrained her own desires, suppressing questions of her own heart in the face of his preoccupations. Marius, consumed by public duty, occasionally overlooked the quiet sorrows of his own household, believing that the city's welfare outweighed the personal. One evening, Cosette ventured out to visit a community of artisans in the district near the river. She walked past narrow alleys where laundry hung on lines like colorful banners, past children barefoot and unafraid, past windows behind which families huddled for warmth. In one small room, she saw a mother rocking a sick child, her eyes hollow yet determined. The sight tore at Cosette, stirring emotions long kept at bay. She stayed, offering what comfort she could, small parcels of food and words of encouragement. Returning home in the darkness, Cosette found Marius seated by the window, quill in hand, writing feverishly. His letters, she realized, were petitions, pleas, and reports, each one an attempt to reconcile the world's cruelty with the moral imperative he had inherited. She sat silently beside him, feeling the distance between them, a rift not of disdain, but of the sheer magnitude of the lives they had vowed to touch. In these moments, the first seeds of tragedy were planted, not by malice, but by circumstance. Miscommunication, misunderstanding, and the invisible pressure of expectation began to shape their daily existence. Cosette, sensitive and cautious, feared that a single misstep could shatter the fragile equilibrium they maintained. Marius, emboldened yet exhausted by his public role, pressed onward, unaware that the tensions building at home mirrored the unrest in the city itself. Days turned into weeks, and the rain gave way to summer heat. Yet beneath the bright sky, shadows lingered. Cosette began to notice subtle signs: the hurried, distracted gestures of Marius, the letters that remained unopened for days, the weight of unspoken words that pressed against the walls of their shared life. She tried to speak, tried to bridge the widening space between them, yet found her voice faltering in the face of his silent preoccupations. It was in this delicate imbalance that the world conspired to teach them its cruelest lesson. For life, as Jean Valjean had known all too well, is rarely linear, rarely just.
Even those who act with the purest of hearts may find themselves ensnared by forces beyond comprehension. And so, as night fell over Paris, the city breathing quietly beneath the stars, Cosette and Marius remained seated in their apartment, each lost in thought. Outside, the streets hummed with life, unaware of the silent struggles unfolding behind closed doors. They would soon learn, as all mortals do, that love and duty, compassion and responsibility are often intertwined with tragedy in ways that cannot be anticipated, and that even the best intentions may lead inexorably toward heartbreak. The shadows of life had begun to stretch long, curling around the edges of their existence, and neither Cosette nor Marius yet knew how profoundly these shadows would shape the days to come. The summer air was heavy with the scent of blooming chestnut trees, yet inside the apartment of Cosette and Marius, tension hung thick, invisible yet suffocating. The months since Jean Valjean's passing had brought them no true peace. Life, in its relentless insistence, had demanded more than comfort or reflection. It demanded choices, and choices bore consequences they could not always foresee. It began innocuously, as most tragedies do. A minor quarrel over a household matter, a mislaid letter, a disagreement over charitable contributions, breathed a brief flame of anger into an otherwise calm evening. Cosette, meticulous and conscientious, had been preparing for the arrival of a guest, a woman from one of the poorer districts who relied on their discreet assistance. Marius, exhausted from hours of political debate and city council meetings, had returned home later than expected, his patience thin, his mind preoccupied with matters far beyond the walls of their home. Words were exchanged, sharp, unintended, tinged with frustration. Cosette spoke with a tremor in her voice, careful yet firm. Marius replied, attempting conciliation, but the weight of unspoken stress bore down upon both of them. The disagreement, trivial in the eyes of any outsider, intensified in the crucible of exhaustion and expectation. And then the moment came. A candle flickered and fell upon the edge of the table, sending a small blaze toward the drapery. Cosette, in a sudden surge of panic, reached for the nearest object to extinguish the flame, a heavy, ornate letter opener that had once belonged to Valjean. In the chaos of movement, the object slipped, and Marius, stepping back instinctively, stumbled.
The apartment seemed to hold its breath. A sharp cry, a sudden stillness, and then the realization. Marius had fallen, struck in a manner both inadvertent and irreversible. Cosette, frozen, her hand trembling, dropped the letter opener. Her mind raced in disbelief. The love of her life, her companion, her anchor in a world still reeling from Valjean's absence, lay motionless. For a long, unbearable moment, time refused to advance. The bustling city outside continued unaware. The faint laughter of children from the streets below floated upward, indifferent to the disaster unfolding within the apartment. Cosette knelt beside him, pressing her hands upon his chest, whispering his name in desperation, hoping against reason that he might respond. But life, in its cruel impartiality, had decreed otherwise. When the authorities arrived, neighbors summoned by the noise, they found Cosette pale, shaking, and speechless. No malice had accompanied her actions, only an unfortunate combination of fear, haste, and circumstance. Yet the law, rigid and unfeeling, could not discern intent from consequence. Cosette was taken, first to answer questions, then to face the inexorable machinery of justice. Within the stone walls of the courthouse, she confronted a world that did not see her sorrow, only the outcome of her momentary panic. Lawyers debated technicalities, witnesses recounted fragmented observations, and the judge presided with solemn detachment. Cosette, for her part, could only cling to the memory of Jean Valjean's counsel, that compassion and humanity must guide judgment. But this was a world in which letters, reports, and rigid statutes often outweighed the voice of conscience. Meanwhile, the city murmured. Whispers of the incident passed through the streets of Paris, mingling with rumors of political intrigue, social unrest, and human frailty. Marius's death, though tragic and undeserved, became a point of reflection for some, a topic of gossip for others. Cosette, however, lived within her own torment, each moment a reminder of how fragile happiness could be, how swiftly circumstance could obliterate the careful constructions of love and trust. Her nights in the small, dimly lit cell were endless. The cold stone walls absorbed her sobs. The faint echo of footsteps in the corridor became her only companions. Dreams haunted her sleep, images of Marius smiling, laughing, calling her name, juxtaposed with the memory of the fatal moment. She often imagined she could still hear Valjean's voice, gentle and firm, reminding her to act with courage and integrity. Yet even his memory offered no reprieve from the relentless guilt she felt. Outside, life went on as it always had. The poor struggled, merchants shouted, and the wheels of the city turned without pause. Yet within the walls of the prison, Cosette experienced time in a different dimension. Each hour stretched and waited with despair. And it was there, in that liminal space between memory and reality, that she began to perceive the pattern that had governed so many lives before her, the cycle of unintended consequences, the fragile line between virtue and tragedy, the inescapable hand of fate.
For in the tragedy of that night lay a lesson as old as history itself. No one, not even a woman of kindness and courage, could fully shield herself or her loved ones from the caprice of circumstance. Cosette realized that the life she had inherited from Jean Valjean, rich in moral guidance and human compassion, also bore the latent shadow of inevitability. That even the purest intentions could yield sorrow, that love could not guarantee safety, and that the human heart must endure trials it cannot predict. And so, as the candlelight flickered upon the cold walls, Cosette, seated on the hard bench of her confinement, understood that the story of her life, like that of Valjean, was entwined with a pattern far larger than herself. A pattern of suffering and love, of justice and misfortune, of moments where the cruel hands of fate could transform a gesture of care into an irreversible catastrophe. The winter of Paris arrived with a brittle severity, the kind that seeped into bones and hearts alike. Cosette, now confined within the cold walls of a stone prison, had become intimately acquainted with a solitude so absolute that it seemed to alter the very nature of time. Each day stretched interminably. Each night fell heavy with shadows, and every breath she drew seemed to echo the absence of Marius and the life that had been snatched from her in an instant. She had learned to measure life by its smallest increments, the rustle of footsteps along the corridor, the scraping of a key in the lock, the distant hum of the city beyond thick walls. Letters from the outside world arrived infrequently, often containing only formalities, yet she treasured them, clinging to the faintest whisper of connection to life beyond stone and iron. And always, in the deepest hours of night, the memory of Marius rose before her like a ghost she could neither embrace nor escape. Cosette's thoughts frequently returned to Jean Valjean, imagining his voice guiding her, comforting her. She wondered whether he too had recognized the futility inherent in the human struggle, how one could strive to right wrongs, yet remain ensnared by circumstances beyond control. In her silence, she traced the same truths that Valjean had lived and understood, that love, courage, and integrity were gifts, yet fragile ones, easily shattered by the indifference or cruelty of the world.
The trial that had followed Marius's death was both swift and merciless. Though the evidence was thin and testimony conflicted, the machinery of law was implacable. Cosette's defense rested upon intent, upon the argument that the act was accidental, yet intent, in the eyes of the court, mattered little compared to outcome. The judges spoke in measured tones, but the verdict was preordained by a society that had no room for nuance. Cosette was condemned, her punishment a reflection not merely of her action, but of the unyielding demands of justice and the inexorable pressures of fate.
As she was led from the courtroom, Cosette's gaze lingered on the crowd outside, where faces blurred into an indistinct sea. Some looked upon her with pity, others with curiosity, but all were participants in a world that had shaped the events beyond her control. She realized, with a crushing clarity, that she had stepped into the same cycle that had ensnared so many before her. Jean Valjean, in life and in death, had been both actor and victim in a chain of circumstance. She now occupied his place, her innocence irrelevant to the inexcusable momentum of consequence. In her cell, Cosette began to perceive the invisible threads connecting past and present. The stories of those who had suffered, of those who had loved and lost, converged in her mind, weaving a tapestry of human experience that was at once beautiful and tragic. The lessons of compassion, courage, and selflessness endured, yet were inextricably entwined with loss, misfortune, and the relentless repetition of sorrow. She spent her days reflecting, reading scraps of texts she had brought from the apartment, recalling every lesson Valjean had imparted. His emphasis on mercy, his insistence upon integrity, his unshakable belief in human dignity, all of it remained, like a distant lighthouse illuminating the stormy seas of her present existence. Yet even this guidance could not shield her from the consequences that life, impartial and unsparing, had decreed. Outside, Paris continued unabated. The poor struggled in the streets, political unrest simmered beneath polished facades, and life pressed onward, indifferent to the suffering of those like Cosette. The cycle of hardship and resilience, of injustice and fleeting reprieve, continued as it had for generations. Mothers whispered caution to children, fathers labored with silent endurance, and the echoes of past struggles reverberated in every alleyway and courtyard. And in this realization, Cosette found both despair and a somber kind of understanding. She recognized that her own story, though singular in its particulars, was part of a greater human narrative, a narrative in which courage and virtue existed alongside cruelty and misfortune, where the best of intentions might yield suffering, and where life's lessons were learned not merely through triumph, but through endurance of hardship. Yet even in the bleakest hours, the faintest ember of hope persisted. Cosette recalled Jean Valjean's capacity for transformation, his ability to rise above circumstance, however constrained. She resolved in the silence of her confinement to maintain her own moral compass, to act with integrity in the ways that remained within her control. Though the cycle seemed endless, though the world continued to impose trials without warning or mercy, she would bear witness to goodness, preserve the memory of love, and honor the life that had been entrusted to her. The snow fell outside her window one evening, blanketing the city in quiet, luminous white. In that stillness, Cosette understood the full weight of her inheritance. Not merely wealth or comfort, but the moral and emotional legacy of Jean Valjean. She was part of a continuum, a link in an unbroken chain of human striving, suffering, and perseverance. And while she would endure grief, loss, and the harsh judgments of a world indifferent to circumstance, she also carried the potential for compassion, mercy, and resilience, the same qualities that had defined Valjean and illuminated the lives of those he had touched. In the end, the cycle of life persisted, indifferent to her personal anguish, yet inseparable from the choices she made and the virtues she upheld. Cosette, gazing at the fading light, understood that the story of Jean Valjean had not ended with his death. It lived on in her, in Marius's memory, and in the unbroken thread of humanity that stretched through the streets, the courts, the homes, and the hearts of Paris. And so, with a mixture of sorrow and quiet resolve, Cosette embraced her role within this ceaseless continuum. She knew that tragedy could strike without warning, that human suffering would repeat, yet within her heart remained the courage to endure, to act, and to preserve the fragile but enduring light of virtue. The cycle was unending, but so too was the capacity for love, for compassion, and for moral courage.